God is simple? Today on Simply Bible. If we were meeting for the first time and we were talking and I wanted to describe myself to you or you to me, we would probably begin with our physical characteristics, maybe our height or hair color, eye color. It maybe even go beyond that to whether or not we're married or what we do for a living or what we like to do in our spare time and our hobbies. All of these characteristics make us who we are. But even if they changed, we switch jobs, we switch careers, we pick up a new hobby, we dye our hair. Even if these characteristics change, we're still the same person. Now, that's not quite true when it comes to knowing God. God is His attributes. And if any of His attributes actually change, then He stops being God. In other words, there's no difference between God's attributes and God's essence. We can't strip God of His attributes to find a simplified being. In fact, even if we strip God of one of His attributes, we take away His very deity. For instance, if we take away God's omniscience, His all-knowing essence, then all of a sudden He stops being God. And so we need to recognize that God, even though He's incomprehensible, He's actually very simple in the terms of what makes Him God. He cannot be divided into parts. Now we, as humans, we have personal attributes that are different, body parts, we have fingers and arms and legs and ears. God doesn't. And so we call this God's simplicity. In other words, God isn't complex. All of God's attributes put together make God who He is. He cannot be divided. In other words, His attributes can't be put into compartments. God's simplicity means also that His attributes define one another. So we look at some of God's attributes and we say, well, God is patient and He's eternal and He's loving, He's merciful. Well, all of these attributes actually describe His other attributes. And so when we think about His omnipotence, God's all-powerful, we say, well, God is patiently omnipotent. God is lovingly omnipotent. He's mercifully omnipotent. When we think about His eternal nature, we could say, well, He's eternally patient. He's eternally loving. He's eternally merciful. And that's the same for all of His attributes, His love, His justice, His mercy, all of those. Every attribute of God is equally important, and every single attribute defines the other attributes. And so recognizing God's simplicity can help us better understand the difference between God and humanity. Because unlike any of God's creation, His attributes perfectly and uniformly define one another. And unlike humanity, God's attributes cannot be separated from one another. Now, sometimes we will make a distinction between God's communicable and His incommunicable attributes. Now, when we talk about something that's communicable, that's something that can be transferred from one person to another. For instance, you catch a cold, you get the flu. Well, you tend to kind of quarantine yourself for a little while just because you're contagious. You don't want to give it to anyone else. Diseases like the flu or a cold, those are, we say, communicable. And so it's the same way with certain attributes of God. They're communicable. We're talking about His love, His holiness, His grace. These attributes can partially be transmitted to human beings. Now, the description itself, it's not perfect because God's communicable attributes can't completely be communicated. In other words, we as human beings, we're not going to be perfectly loving. We're not going to be perfectly gracious. but God does share some of these attributes with us to a certain degree. Now, there's also attributes that are incommunicable. And these are those that cannot be imitated at all by humanity. Even God himself could not transfer his incommunicable attributes to someone else. That becomes logically impossible. And so, in other words, it would be impossible for God to create another God. If he did so, this created God, well, that's just a created being. It would lack the necessary attributes that only God could possess. Things like his self-existent nature or his eternal nature. So unlike God, human beings can never truly be independent. To exist, we have to be first created. And then once we're created, we're then dependent upon our environment for our survival. We have to have air to breathe. We have to have water to drink, food to eat. And there are a lot of situations where we're actually at the mercy of other people when we think about our health care and our safety. But God is not dependent on anything. God is eternal. He's self-existent. He's self-sufficient. And he has the power of being in and of himself. And this is what we call God's aseity. It's actually from a Latin term meaning of oneself. Acts 17:24, Paul is speaking here, and he says, "The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything." Now, implied here in this scripture is that God does not depend on man. In fact, the opposite is true. We are dependent completely and entirely on him. In fact, our very existence is a pure act of grace. Now, some want to say, well, stop a minute. God made humanity because he was lonely. And they'll claim that he needed someone to give him company, but this, biblically speaking, is completely wrong. If that were true, that would mean that God needed to create someone else in order to be happy or in order to be fulfilled. But God is completely independent of his creation. He does not need us at all. Now, the Bible does say that God is love, and love cannot exist without an object for that love. And so the question then becomes, well, who did God love before he created humans? Well, Jesus answers that for us. He's praying to God in John 17, verse 5. He says, "Father, glorify me in your own presence with the glory that I had with you before the world existed." A few verses later, in verse 24, he would say, "Because God loved him before the foundation of the world." Jesus is saying here that the Father and the Son had love and togetherness before the universe was ever even created. And so God never had any sort of emotional need for mankind. But the Bible talks a lot about God's aseity. No one can overturn what God does. Isaiah 43 and verse 12, "I am God. Even from eternity, I am he, and there is none who can deliver out of my hand. I act, and who can reverse it?" God is completely free to act according to his own will. He always has been, always will be. In Psalm 90, Moses writes, "Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God." God, being self-existent, is in fact the only possible explanation for the creation of the universe. Revelation 4 and verse 11 says, "For you created all things, and by your will they existed and were created." God is infinitely stronger than anything else in the universe. God exists in a better way than anything else in the universe. And God isn't merely bigger than us. Sometimes we'll like to use the examples, well, we're just a drop in the water. We're like a drop of water compared to the ocean, or we're an anthill compared to a mountain, or we're a speck of dust compared to the planet Earth. But But none of those illustrations are adequate. In fact, God is simply fundamentally different than us. He's our creator. Everything else, including us, we're just made. God is perfect. We're imperfect. God is complete. We're limited. Everything else could just go away right now in a snap, in an instant, and God would still be God. Now, we think about this, and we might be tempted, and we have to be careful of this, we might be tempted to start to view ourselves as not having any meaning. We ask the question, well, what's the purpose behind human existence? And the Bible tells us that humans bring God joy. He created us, and He has given us meaning. In fact, Isaiah 43:7, he's talking about here every human being ever created. He says, everyone who is called by my name, whom I created for my glory, whom I formed and made. Now, God was under no obligation to create us, but He decided to do so that we could glorify Him. That means we find our value in God. When we live for God, we find our worth. Now, the opposite is also true. When we depart from God's will, all of a sudden we forfeit our very purpose for existence. There is no value apart from God. In fact, meaning is only found in God. God has given us the ability to bring Him real joy and real pleasure. And while God doesn't need us for anything, it's an awesome thought to think that God, in His own free will, decided to delight in us. Isaiah 62 and verse 3 says, "You shall be a crown of beauty in the hand of the Lord, and a royal diadem in the hand of your God." To be valuable to God makes us more valuable than all the riches in the world. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this content, make sure to hit the thumbs up button and subscribe to our channel. If you hit the bell notification, you'll be notified when new videos are uploaded. And if you have any questions or comments, please leave them down below. Thank you for watching.